I know what you're thinking. Are we going to actually write any JavaScript code anytime soon? Yes, right now and for the rest of the course. This lecture is the global environment and the global object. Whenever code is run in JavaScript, it's run inside an execution context. We've seen that word already, meaning a wrapper that the JavaScript engine, the program that other people wrote that's parsing and looking at and verifying and executing your code, that wraps that up, that code that you've written. It wraps the currently executing code in an execution context. So when we look at our very first JavaScript program, we're going to be looking at an execution context being created and run. And the base execution context, we'll look at a few, because there's more than one that runs during a JavaScript program normally. The base execution context is your global execution context. And it has a couple of special things that come along for the ride. The base execution context, the global execution context, and when we say global, we're talking about the thing that's accessible everywhere to everything in your code. It's global. All right, so the global execution context creates two things for you. You don't have to in your code. It creates a global object. Number in objects is just a collection of name-value pairs. It creates this global object, and it creates a special variable for you called this. The JavaScript engine is creating these two things for you whenever your code is run, because your code is wrapped inside an execution context. And these two things are created for you by the JavaScript engine. All right, let's take a look. All right, it's that time. We're going to look at our very first JavaScript program. Now, we're going to run our JavaScript in the browser. This is very convenient, again, because we have our dev tools and we can see what's going on under the hood a little bit easier. But we're going to do that simply by having a simple HTML page referencing a single script I'm calling app.js, which will always contain the code that we're working with. I have this sitting in a folder, and I'm opening that folder in brackets. And then I'm going to hit this button in the upper right in order to launch Google Chrome and run this web page, which will then cause the browser to run this JavaScript. That's how we'll do all of our examples. All right, so are you ready? Here's our very first JavaScript program. Let's open app.js. There it is. What do you think? I know what you're thinking. Hey, that's empty. There's nothing in that file. All right. Well, you're right. I wrote no code. Let's run it. I'm going to hit my live preview button. Google Chrome launches. And then I'm going to open up the dev console. Notice there are no errors. The JavaScript file was loaded. The syntax parser started and realized there is nothing to parse. So I had no code to execute. But because it started executing the JavaScript, because it ran the file, an execution context was created. And remember those two things that were supposed to be created for us. A global object and a special variable called this. Well, inside here, inside the DevTools console window, I can take a peek inside the execution context at the values of variables and what's going on in memory. So if I just go this, look, there's something there. Now, I didn't build this. I didn't put that in the code. The code is empty. But the execution context was created by the JavaScript engine, and it decided what the value of this should be. And what this is the window, the current window that I'm in, my browser window, because I'm running JavaScript in the browser. Interestingly, I have available an object called window, the same object. So this window object, the current tab that I'm on is the global object inside browsers. Now, if you're using Node.js, if you're running JavaScript on the server, it won't be the window object. There's a different global object, but there is always a global object when you're running JavaScript. In the case of browsers, it's the window. If I had a separate tab open, that would be a separate global object because each tab, each window is its own execution context, its own global execution context. But notice I have these two values and I wrote no code. That's the JavaScript engine doing this for me. So we just learned something. An execution context was created at the global level. There's a global object, meaning that object is available to all the code running inside that window, inside that area, inside that JavaScript file, inside that lexical environment. And there's a special variable that the JavaScript engine created that sits inside the execution context called this. And what we saw was that the global object inside browsers, inside internet browsers like Google Chrome or Firefox or whatever the case, is the window object. And that it did create a variable called this, and at the global level, those two things are equal. This refers to the window object. And you can also just say window and get the global object. Now, just to be really clear, when we say global, in JavaScript, that means not inside a function. Don't think too much deeper than that. That means code or variables that aren't inside a function is global. All right, so we already saw that we have window and this, a global object and this, available to us without a single line of code. Now, what happens when we actually put some code in? All right, let's write our first bit of code. I'll create a variable and call it A, and just give it a value. Hello world. And I'm going to create a function called B, and just leave it empty. Got that? A variable and a function. And now I'll run this, and I'll actually have some code. Now, the execution context is created. This code is not inside a function, although I'm creating a function here. All this code is not inside a function, so it's global. This and window are already available to me, and you'll see something interesting. If I look at window and open it up, remember JavaScript objects are name-value pairs, so here's lots of names and lots of values. The function can be a value. But if I scroll down a ways, there, see that? A and B, my variable and my function. In JavaScript, when you create variables and functions, and you're not inside a function, those variables and functions get attached to the global object. So if I just go like this, A, it's hello world. But I could also go window.a, the global object.a. It's the same thing. See that? So your variables and your functions, when lexically not sitting inside a function, they're just sitting right there on the global object. All right, so when code is executed, your JavaScript code is executed, an execution context is created. At the base level, when you're not inside a function, you have a global object that the JavaScript engine creates for you as part of that execution context. If you're running code inside a browser, that global object is the window object. You get a special variable called this. And in the case of the browser, this at that global level is just the same as the window object. It's equal to the window object. There's also something that is something we haven't talked about yet, and we will shortly. A link to the outer environment. Now, when you're running code inside a function, That means the code that's outside the function. But when you're running at the global level, meaning you're not inside a function, well, there is nothing outside. You're as outside as you can get. There's no outer environment. So that's just null. It's nothing at the global level. But we'll see this come up later, very importantly, when running and executing functions. And finally, the execution context is running your code. If you're creating variables and functions, then that's going to sit on the global object if you're writing code that is global. Again, that's not inside a function. But the important thing here is that there is this wrapper, this execution context, which has these other things that you didn't write. And JavaScript, the JavaScript engine running your code, is doing this for you. All right, so let's move on.